May 5, 1945, Wageningen, Western Netherlands. The war was finally ending. American trucks rolled into town, engines rumbling through the cold morning air, but instead of cheers, they found silence. No waving flags, no smiling faces. Only thin children standing in wooden shoes, too weak to move. One soldier stepped down, opened a box, and pulled out a chocolate bar. He handed it to a little girl. She didn't eat it. She just stared at it, then began to cry. That moment said everything. The war was over, but hunger was not. This was not a victory parade, it was a rescue. A meeting between hunger and hope. What happened next would become one of the most powerful, forgotten stories of World War II, when food fell from the sky and strangers became saviors. Stay with us till the end to see how the Americans turned warplanes into lifelines. Like this video, subscribe to keep these true stories alive, and share it to remind others what real victory looks like. The morning of May 5, 1945, was quiet in the small Dutch town of Wageningen. The war in Europe was almost over. American trucks rolled slowly down the broken streets. Their engines growled in the cold air. The soldiers expected people to come running, smiling, shouting for freedom, but no one cheered. The streets were almost empty. From behind doors and broken windows, thin faces watched. Children stood still, dressed in worn coats and wooden shoes. Their eyes were large and tired. One soldier looked down and saw a little girl staring at the chocolate bar in his hand. It was something simple to him, just a piece of candy from a ration pack. But to her it looked like something from another world. He knelt and offered it to her. The girl took it with both hands, so gently it was as if she thought it might break. Then, without a word, she began to cry. Her shoulders shook, and the sound filled the quiet street. Behind her, more children appeared, thin, pale, and hungry. The soldier looked back at his comrades. None of them spoke. They just opened more boxes. The smell of chocolate mixed with diesel and spring air. A mother whispered, "We thought we were forgotten." One soldier later wrote, "I had seen death in battle, but I never saw pain like hunger." Before that day, the soldiers had fought to defeat an enemy. Now they were fighting a different kind of battle, against hunger, against despair. And this fight did not need guns, only food and compassion. That first piece of chocolate started something larger. Soon, more soldiers joined in. They gave their rations to the people who had nothing left. They shared cans of soup, crackers, powdered milk. The Dutch civilians, too weak to thank them properly, simply cried or held their hands. It was strange for the Americans. They had been trained to win through strength and power, but here, victory came through kindness. As one officer said later, "We didn't realize we could save a life just by sharing lunch." The sound of children chewing slowly replaced the silence of fear. It was a small miracle, proof that even after years of war, humanity could still rise from the ruins. But the soldiers soon learned that this one starving town was only a small part of a much bigger tragedy. Across the Netherlands, millions had suffered the same fate. What they saw next would stay with them for the rest of their lives. This was not just liberation, it was survival. As the American soldiers moved deeper into the Dutch towns, they began to understand how bad things truly were. Streets were quiet, houses stood dark, and even the animals were gone. The people who came out looked like shadows, weak, thin, and moving slowly. One soldier wrote, "It was like walking into a ghost village." They saw families who had not eaten a real meal in months. Children's faces were pale, their bellies swollen from hunger. Some could not even lift their heads. The soldiers tried to smile, but it was hard when they realized how deep the suffering went. Inside homes there were strange smells, a mix of sickness, smoke, and something sweet like old bread. Tables were bare except for cups of water or tiny pieces of dried potato. Many families had burned their furniture during the winter to keep warm. Doors creaked in the wind because there was no glass left in the windows. The soldiers opened their trucks and gave away everything they had: cans of beans, powdered milk, army biscuits. Children lined up, not shouting or laughing, just waiting in silence. When the food came, They didn't rush or fight. They were too weak for that. One American noticed how carefully they chewed each bite, as if afraid it might disappear. In the nearby villages, it was the same. Doctors later counted more than 20,000 people dead from hunger during what would be called the Dutch hunger winter. In Amsterdam alone, the average person had lived on only 400–500 calories a day, less than a small sandwich. Some had survived by boiling tulip bulbs, others by mixing weeds into soup. And still, the Dutch people tried to stay polite. One soldier said, "Even when we gave them food, they said thank you." They hadn't eaten properly in weeks, but they still said thank you. For the soldiers, this changed everything they thought they knew about war. They had seen explosions and battles, but they had never seen people slowly fade away from lack of food. Hunger was quiet, but it was deadly. That night, a few soldiers built a small kitchen near the town square. They boiled water and cooked soup in metal pots. The smell spread through the streets, warm, rich, full of life. People followed the scent like a promise. For the first time in months, they were about to eat a real meal. The soldiers watched as parents helped their children sip the soup. Some smiled through tears. Others could not stop crying. "This is the taste of peace," one Dutch woman whispered. But the soldiers still wondered, how could this have happened? How could a country full of farms and canals end up starving? The answer lay not in this town, but in what had happened months before, when the war had trapped the Netherlands in a cruel blockade that turned bread into a weapon. To understand the hunger, we must go back to the autumn of 1944. The Allies had freed southern Holland after the big battle called Operation Market Garden. But the north, including cities like Amsterdam, Rotterdam and The Hague, was still under German control. The people there believed freedom was close. They could hear Allied planes above. They hoped each day would bring rescue. Then something terrible happened. The Dutch railway workers went on strike to help the Allies. They stopped the trains so that German troops couldn't move supplies. But the Germans answered with cruel revenge. They blocked all food, fuel and medicine from going to the western part of the Netherlands. Barges on rivers were stopped. Trains were locked, trucks were banned. It was the start of what people would later call the Hunger Winter. At first, people tried to survive with what little they had. Families cut bread into thinner and thinner slices. Neighbors shared potatoes and dried peas. But as the weeks passed, there was nothing left. The cold winds came early that year, and by December the canals froze solid. The cities were trapped, no food in, no escape out. The German soldiers took most of the crops to feed their army. Even farmers in nearby villages had almost nothing left. People started to eat strange things: tulip bulbs, sugar beet, animal feed, and even wallpaper paste. Some boiled grass or made soup from water and flower petals. In Amsterdam, people began to break apart wooden fences and furniture to burn for warmth. One man wrote in his diary, "The sound of chopping wood is everywhere. We burn our memories to survive." By January 1945, doctors reported that the average adult weighed only 95 pounds 43 kilograms. The daily ration had dropped to only 400 calories, about the same as one small chocolate bar. Children fainted in school from weakness. Hospitals ran out of medicine and bandages. Still, the people tried to stay strong. Teachers kept schools open when they could. Churches shared whatever food they found. The Dutch spirit, calm, polite, and proud, refused to break. But hunger does not care about courage. Every week, more people died quietly in their homes. The Allies knew what was happening, but they could not reach the starving cities yet. The front line was still far away, and every bridge or road was destroyed. One British officer said sadly, "We could see the people starving through our binoculars, but we could not get to them." The hunger was no accident. It was a weapon, a cruel punishment by the German occupiers for the Dutch resistance and their loyalty to the Allies. It was meant to break their spirit, but it did not. The people held on, hoping that spring would bring both food and freedom. And when the winter finally came to its end, the world would see just how far a nation had gone to survive, and how the Allies answered that suffering from the sky above The winter of 1944–45 was one of the coldest anyone could remember. Snow fell for weeks. The canals froze so hard that even horses could walk across them. But the cold was not the worst part. It was the hunger. Every day people woke up weaker. They searched for anything that could be eaten. Families took long walks into the countryside, pushing bicycles without tires, hoping to trade clothes or family treasures for a few potatoes. Sometimes they walked 20 or 30 kilometers in freezing weather, only to return with almost nothing. A mother from Rotterdam wrote in her diary, "We sold Father Sepp's watch for 2 loaves of bread. They were gone in 2 days." Children tried to catch birds or peel bark from trees. Old men chopped wooden doors and chairs to make firewood. Even city parks were empty. Every tree cut down for heat. By January, people were eating tulip bulbs. They peeled them like onions and boiled them into a bitter soup. The Dutch called it the Hunger Winter. The Hunger Winter. By March, at least 20,000 people had died from starvation and cold. But doctors believed the true number was much higher. Many deaths were never recorded because families were too weak to report them. Hospitals became places of quiet suffering. Nurses wrapped starving children in blankets, trying to keep them warm. One doctor from Amsterdam wrote, "Their bodies were so small the bones showed through the skin. We gave them water with sugar, but even that was too much for some." And yet, people still shared what they had. In some neighborhoods, mothers took turns cooking 1 pot of thin soup to feed 10 or 12 families. In others, strangers gave away their last piece of bread to a child. The hunger didn't just steal food, it stole time and hope. Days blended together in silence. The sound of footsteps on frozen streets was the only reminder that life still existed. In April, some German soldiers began to realize the Dutch were dying. Even a few of them felt shame. One officer secretly allowed farmers to bring food into towns, breaking orders from his superiors. It was small, but it saved lives. Then, at last, the rumors began to spread. The Allies are coming. People were too weak to celebrate, but hope began to return. The war was almost over. The Germans were retreating. But could food arrive before more people died? The Allies faced a terrible choice: move fast to end the war, or stop to help the starving civilians first. And so the decision was made to do something never done before, to drop food from the sky over enemy territory. The mission had one goal: feed the Netherlands before it was too late. When the war finally ended, doctors and nurses began to write down what they had seen during the terrible months of hunger. Their stories were shocking and heartbreaking. In hospitals across the Netherlands, doctors found children who weighed less than 25 kilograms, 55 pounds, at 12 years old. Some could no longer walk. Their hair had turned thin and grey, their skin pale and dry. Many had swollen bellies, a sign of extreme hunger, called hunger edema. One nurse in The Hague remembered, "We had no medicine left. We boiled sheets to use as bandages." The children were so weak, even drinking milk made them sick. The hospitals had no fuel for heat. The rooms were cold and dark. Nurses wrapped patients in whatever they could find: old coats, newspaper, even curtains. Sometimes the only sound was coughing or the quiet whisper of someone praying. Doctors tried to count how many people had died, but the numbers kept rising. They estimated that more than 20,000 had starved to death in just a few months. In some towns, half the children under 10 were malnourished. One doctor wrote, "It was not war that killed them, but hunger." Still, many people showed incredible strength. Dutch women risked their lives to collect food for others. Some rode broken bicycles miles through snow to bring back a few potatoes hidden under their coats. Children also tried to help. A young boy from Leiden later said, "I went to the countryside with my father. We traded my mother Sepp's wedding ring for some bread. I never forgot how it tasted." Even after the war, scientists studied the effects of this hunger. They discovered that babies born during the hunger winter were smaller and had more health problems as adults. The starvation had changed their bodies forever. But what surprised everyone was how the Dutch people kept their dignity. Even in starvation, they remained polite and calm. A British Red Cross worker said, "They queued in silence, no pushing, no shouting. They thanked us for every crumb. By spring 1945, many believed that thousands more would die before help could arrive. The railways were broken, roads destroyed, bridges gone. Sending trucks was almost impossible. That was when the Allies, British and American pilots, came up with a daring plan. They would drop food from planes, but to do that, they would have to fly low, over enemy land, without being shot at. It seemed impossible. Yet, it was the only hope left for millions of starving people. The skies above the Netherlands were about to fill, not with bombs, but with bread. At the end of April 1945, the Dutch people heard a strange sound in the distance, the deep hum of airplane engines. For months, that sound had meant danger. Planes had brought bombs and destruction, but this time, the sound meant something very different. Children ran outside, pointing to the sky. Huge silver planes were flying low over the fields. They had white stars painted on their sides. American and British bombers. But instead of bombs, something else began to fall from them. Brown sacks and metal containers dropped gently by parachutes. When they hit the ground, people rushed toward them. The sacks burst open, spilling flour, sugar, and tins of food. For a moment, no one could believe it. Food was falling from the sky. This was Operation Manna and Operation Chowhound, two missions planned by the Allies to save the starving Dutch people. Between April 29th and May 8th, 1945, more than 11,000 tons of food were dropped by British and American planes. Each bomber carried about 6,500 pounds of food instead of weapons. The Germans agreed to a temporary truce. They promised not to fire on the planes. Even some German soldiers stood and watched quietly as the bombers flew low and steady. One Dutch farmer said, "We waved at them with white sheets." The sky looked like heaven itself. The food drops were carefully organized. Pilots aimed for open fields, racetracks, and canals so that people could collect the packages safely. Inside were tins of meat, powdered milk, chocolate, biscuits, and flour. Each drop could feed thousands. One pilot later said, "We flew so low we could see people waving flags below. Some even spelled out Thingthax boys sist with white stones." For the Dutch people, it was a miracle. They laughed and cried at the same time. Children danced around the sacks of flour. Mothers hugged soldiers they had never met. The smell of bread began to return to kitchens after months of emptiness. In one village, a woman baked small loaves from the flour dropped by the planes. She gave each child one piece and said, "This is freedom bread." For many, that first meal was more than food. It was a sign that they had survived. The war was almost over. Hope was back. In total, the Allied food drops saved tens of thousands of lives. Historians still call it one of the greatest humanitarian missions of the war. But for the soldiers on the ground, the work was not finished. They were about to enter the towns they had helped from the sky, and there, they would see the true face of hunger up close. The battlefields were quiet now, but the battle for life had only just begun. May 5th, 1945. The guns finally went silent. In towns across Western Netherlands, German soldiers laid down their weapons. The war in Europe was ending. But for the Dutch people, liberation did not begin with fireworks or loud cheers. It began with silence, the silence of exhaustion, hunger, and disbelief. When the American and Canadian troops entered the cities, they expected to see celebrations, waving flags, smiling faces, maybe even music. Instead, they found streets filled with thin, pale figures. People moved slowly, their steps weak. Some were too tired to stand. Children leaned on parents who were barely stronger than they were. Staff Sergeant William Cooper from the 101st Airborne remembered stopping his jeep near a small Dutch town. A little girl stood by the road. Her dress was too big for her thin body, her eyes large and hollow. Cooper knelt down and handed her a small piece of chocolate, a simple thing for a soldier, but to her it was everything. She clutched it tightly and whispered, "Thank you." Then she began to cry. Behind her, more children came forward, dozens of them, silent, watching. The soldiers realized what starvation really looked like. "We broke open every ration box we had," one soldier wrote. "It was all we could do." Soon, the quiet streets turned into scenes of emotion. American soldiers gave away their rations, canned meat, biscuits, chocolate, and milk powder. Mothers fell to their knees, crying and thanking them. Some kissed the soldiers' hands. Even the toughest men in uniform could not hold back their own tears. "We had seen combat," said one veteran, "but nothing broke us like seeing hungry children eat again." Hospitals and aid centers were quickly set up. Army cooks worked day and night making soup and porridge. Doctors treated people too weak to digest normal food. Some patients were so starved that they could only take spoonfuls of broth at a time. Every meal was a slow step toward life again. In one village, a soldier wrote in his diary, "The children follow us everywhere. They smile again. One little boy gave me a flower." He said it was the only thing he had to give. For many soldiers, that small act of kindness meant more than medals or victory parades. The Dutch people slowly began to rebuild. They opened windows to let in the spring air. They cleaned streets that had been empty for months. Flags appeared again, bright orange, red, white, and blue. But this time, celebration came not from excitement but from relief. They had survived the darkest winter of their lives. For the Americans, it was a different kind of victory. They had come to fight an enemy, but they discovered that the greatest victory was saving lives. The bond formed between the Dutch and their liberators was not built on politics or power, but on compassion. The soldiers had brought food, but more importantly, they brought back faith that kindness could still exist after so much cruelty. And yet, as the Dutch began to eat again and children played in the streets, a question remained: what would come next? Now that the guns were quiet and the world had to start over. The war was finally over, but peace did not come quickly. The Dutch people had survived the hunger, yet their bodies and hearts were still weak. Children who had been close to death needed months of careful care. They couldn't eat normal food right away. Their stomachs had forgotten how. American and Canadian doctors set up special feeding centers. Nurses gave small meals every few hours: warm milk, thin soup, soft bread. Slowly, the children began to gain weight. Their pale faces started to glow again. A doctor in Rotterdam wrote, "Some of the children smiled for the first time in months. That was when I knew they would live." The recovery was not only physical. The war had hurt people's minds too. Children had nightmares about hunger. Parents couldn't stop worrying that food might disappear again. To help, Allied soldiers and Dutch teachers opened schools and started games for the children. Soldiers played baseball with Dutch boys in the fields. Girls sang songs they had learned from the Americans. For the first time in years, the sound of laughter returned to the towns. One Dutch woman said, "The soldiers didn't just bring food. They brought life back to our children." As the months passed, something beautiful happened. The Dutch began to rebuild their cities. Bridges were repaired, farms planted again, shops reopened. But the memory of that terrible winter never left them. Families kept diaries, drawings, and letters from those months as reminders of what they had endured and who had helped them survive. The Americans, too, carried the memories home. Many wrote to their families about what they had seen. One young soldier wrote, "We fought a war to end evil, but the day I gave a starving child a piece of chocolate, that was the day I truly understood why we fought." The bond between the Netherlands and the United States grew stronger because of those moments. To this day, the Dutch people still honor the Allied soldiers who saved them. Each year, during memorial events, children place flowers on the graves of the men who brought them hope. The hunger winter became more than just a story of suffering. It became a lesson in compassion. It showed what happens when ordinary people choose kindness over cruelty, when soldiers choose mercy over orders. For the Dutch children who survived, that kindness changed everything. They grew up in peace, had families of their own, and told their children about the strangers who came with food from the sky. And for the Americans who helped them, it was a reminder that true victory is not just about winning wars, it's about saving lives. They had come as soldiers, but they left as heroes in the hearts of the Dutch people. In the end, America's greatest weapon wasn't its bombs or guns. It was its humanity. Because when the world was starving, they fed it. When hope was gone, they gave it back. And in doing so, They proved that mercy could defeat even the darkest hunger.